everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We are so excited that you are here. And last night up in Fort Collins in northern Colorado, the Northern Lights were spectacular, like breathtaking. So full credit goes to the photographer of this one, which was Karen. And Freddie just shared a really cool video with us of some time lapse that he did. My name is Allison O'Connor. I am with CSU Extension in Larimer County. My co-pilot today is Cassie Anderson, who you have seen numerous times, and our presenter is Freddie, who I'll get to in just a moment. A couple housekeeping things before we get started. The first is that CSU is an equal opportunity, access, and non-discrimination university. If there's anything we can do to accommodate your needs, please let us know, and also visit our website for more information. Specific to this webinar, it is being recorded, and so if you need to leave, if you get bumped out, or if you want to come back and review the materials that Freddie shares with us, it will be posted to planttalk.org/webinars, and Cassie will pop that link into the chat. You can view everything that we have done so far this year. We are in November and we have one more coming up in December. And don't you worry, we are already planning for 2026. On that website, you can also register for anything that we have in the future. Today, we will close down the chat, but please use the Q&A for any questions that you might have. Freddie will have time at the end to answer some questions. Otherwise, Cassie and I on the back end will be answering questions as we are able. And rounding out our webinar series next month on Wednesday, December 10th at noon, we have Jennifer Cook from Gilpin County, who will be talking to us about mindfulness in nature. This is actually a really hot topic right now of what being in green space can do for you, your overall health, your well-being, your emotional health, all of those things. So please register and join us next month. And we will start again in January with a brand new series for 2026. I am thrilled to introduce you to Freddie Haberect, who is a senior forester with the city of Fort Collins, and he is a great friend. He is a really, really fantastic forester, a really phenomenal plants person, and he is going to talk to you today about the basics of pruning. So sit back, relax, and Freddie, take it away. Thanks for joining us.
Excellent. I will pull up my screen here and get going. So I hope everybody's having a good day today, and I hope this information is something new for you that can get you a little bit more of the basic information about how you can prune on your own property, or if you're providing, education and information for folks that are pruning, or, recommendations towards an arborist. So we'll get this queued up here. All right, so today we're going to cover, the general basics of tree biology, how do trees heal over wounds or close wounds, as we would say. What is our tree pruning timing, the basics of pruning, and then the basics of tree structure. So when we talk about pruning, there's multiple different reasons we can prune a tree. When we look at it broadly, what we're doing is we're making that tree fit a form and a function. Right? That function piece, where is it in space? So like for when we talk about street trees, especially, which is most of what the city of Fort Collins maintains, we're looking at how is it getting above cars, how is it shading the street, how is it shading the buildings, and how is it in a way that's, maintainable, right? Safety. We don't want to have limbs coming down on cars. We want to make sure these trees are safe. That's part of our pruning rotation, and, removal of unsafe trees, removal of unsafe limbs. Aesthetics. So some people maintain trees specifically for aesthetic reasons. And then tree health. Is there cuts or other pruning we can do to the tree to make it more healthy? Structure is a big piece of this, and that's more of setting that tree up for success long term to have the best form and function. So we're not having, those snow events or those wind events or other things aren't affecting the tree adversely and limiting its lifespan. So we're trying to, all these things are basically put together to maximize the value and the longevity of a tree in a space. And so when, Zach here, who's one of our arborists for the city of Fort Collins, is pruning, their main objective is going to be for clearance, right? Because if a truck or a person is hitting that tree, the tree really isn't in the right place. And so for us, when we're looking at all these street trees, first thing we're going to go and walk out there is hey, is it 14 feet above the road, which is, general height of like a trash truck, or is it 8 feet above the sidewalk, which is, hey, is somebody riding a bike on the sidewalk? Are they going to get their face caught up in a limb? So we're trying to adjust for that when we're out there pruning. But we'll talk a little bit more about setting those objectives. When pruning, it's really important to have an objective when you walk out there, right? When you walk up to your tree, if you're just pruning it arbitrarily, right? The tree already knows what it's doing. The tree is going to grow in the way that it's got basically chemical signals that are going to tell that tree how to grow and where to grow, to follow light and, to have a leader and all these different things. And we can assist that tree, but, if we're pruning arbitrarily without, without a goal or an objective, it can do more harm than good. And so really when you walk out to a tree or you're doing any sort of pruning or thinking about doing a pruning, I encourage you to um, slow down and take the time to go, why am I pruning and what is my goal here? What is the objective I want to get done? So basic tree biology, we're just going to talk about the anatomy of at the most basic level here. What are we looking at? And I'm going to use these terms throughout the PowerPoint. When we're looking at a tree, what are we looking at, right? So we've got as we know, the trunk. We've got this leader. That's going to be our tallest central stem. That's what's going to become the trunk in time. It's, that we want that to be a defined space in the tree. We've got lateral branches. So those are those side branches off of the main trunk. We can also have lateral branching off of, these scaffold branches, which would be kind of the branching off of a branch. We won't go deep into that. Um, and then we got our first permanent branch. So when we're thinking about pruning a tree, we got to be looking for the future, right? The branches don't move as the tree grows. They stay at the same height, and they probably only get lower as time goes on. So when we're thinking about where our first permanent branch is, we're really thinking about in the future, when this tree is still in the same place, what branches do I want to have for the use of that space? So for us, we're talking about a street tree, right? 14 feet above the road. There's a lot of branches there below that first permanent branch that are temporary branches. They're adding to the tree's health and vigor and trunk taper, um, but they're not permanent. And so we're going to try to work those branches as if they're going to be removed in the future. When we look at a cross section of, a trunk or, branch, right, we've got these multiple parts that are really important to know as far as how that tree heals. So right, we've got the bark. The bark is that protective layer, and there's live bark and this dead tissue of the bark, right? So this is the protective layer. Right underneath that, what is it protecting? Well, it's protecting the cambium. The cambium, as you likely know, is that growth layer underneath the tree. If you ever, scratched any plant, especially trees, is easy, and you go beneath the bark, you'll see this green, white, or kind of pinkish layer underneath, and that's the active growing cells of the tree. That's where the tree is really alive. Inside of that, you have the sapwood. And this is the wood that um, isn't alive in the same extent. It's not going to grow, but it is transporting water and nutrients throughout that tree. And it's the vascular system. This is a relatively young branch, so it doesn't have much heartwood. But heartwood is that older wood that no longer is transporting water, that is primarily structural. And this is where we can have wood rots and other things get into it if it doesn't heal over properly. And then in the very center, especially on young limbs, this is going to be um, more evident is that pith. That pith is as that new tip grows, that is the original center of those cells inside of that. But really what we need to care about when we're pruning trees is that cambium layer, right? Right underneath the bark, that is the only place we're going to have new growth. And so if we're going to be pruning a tree at all, we need to really be focusing on how we're best prioritizing opening up that layer of cambium so that it can heal over that wound. When we say heal, trees don't really heal, right? Um, they close over a wound. There's no amount of wood that will come back. It only produces new wood to cover an old injury. And so what a tree will do when you make a cut is it forms something called callus tissue. And callus tissue is that, that the aggressive growth that comes around when a tree is sensed that it's missing a part of it. So the goal is to try to, maximize proper pruning to maximize callus tissue growth. And trees can grow relatively quickly over a wound if they're healthy and vigorous and the wounding has been done correctly during pruning. So, right, the goal is to have a full wound closure. This would slow decay, right? It's not introducing new fungal or bacterial pathogens into the tree. It limits, air and oxygen too. That also can limit that decay if those decay funguses are already in the tree. And so when we think about this, we say, oh, we want to close over when we want it to seal. Do we want to use paint? Right? This is a common misconception. Used to this very old school thing to do is to paint over wounds. The answer is no. In 99% of cases, we don't want to paint over wounds. The old classic was latex paint or tar paint to paint over a wound and seal it so it doesn't leak or whatever. Even with trees like maples, when you prune them in winter, they'll do a lot of bleeding. Even that is fine. It's more of an aesthetic issue than anything, and the tree knows what it's doing. The tree has all these evolutionary traits that make it so it can close over wounds and prevent decay. And so when we look at that, we don't want to paint our wounds. Now I put a little asterisk here because recent literature there is some specific cases for painting wounds. Specifically, when we talk about painting, it's for disease. So, if anybody's from out east, anybody's familiar with white oak wilt. White oak wilt is a pretty serious vascular disease, fungal vascular disease in the white oak group. So that'd be your white oak and bur oak um, sometimes it gets into red oaks as well. That because there's a beetle that transfers that fungus, painting over a wound can stop that beetle from getting into it, but that would be a 1 in a million case versus most of the time just don't paint wounds. Let the tree seal over it itself. When we talk about the branch attachment, it's really important to look at how the anatomy of the branch attaching to the tree plays into where you should be pruning. So the different parts of branch attachment, we've got the branch bark ridge. This is usually on the upper side of a branch, and it's where that bark basically folds. Where the two lines of tissue meet, and it'll have this folding. And in that picture, you can see it's that line that goes down. It'll be this ring line over the top part of a branch in species where it's very obvious. Um, so there we go. There's that line. And then the next thing we got is the branch collar. The branch collar is that little bulge you see right as you come up that limb. And the branch bark collar, if we look at it and kind of like, why are we looking at this? Why is this important? It's basically the protection zone. So the tree one, that's where they, forms these knitted cells to make it so it's a strong attachment so the branch doesn't break off the tree. And as part of that, it actually has specialized cells and chemicals that limit decay and maximize healing. So it has these extra cells um, so it can close over a wound faster and it's going to stop decay. So we don't want to damage when we're pruning either the branch bark ridge or the branch collar because basically when you damage those, you're just inviting infection into that wound. So we want to leave those alone as best as possible. So we're making a cut, like look at this is where even a tree in the wild, right? This is the natural setting of way this tree grows over a wound, and so this is a northern red oak here in town. It's got a big dead limb in it that hasn't been pruned out, and you can see that branch collar is where that limb would die back to if it's a naturally kind of senescing limb and it will close over. And because the limb's still there, it can't close over that wound, but it can, form this collar. And when you're pruning, it's really important, especially if you're pruning out a dead limb, don't nick and don't cut that collar if it's still there. Cut just outside of it so it can close over the wound. As soon as you damage that collar, you're basically breaking, we say that branch protection zone. We're basically breaking that barrier and providing a space for infection. And so it's really important when we're pruning, try to prune right outside of that branch bark collar. So on this photo here, you can see that little bit of a bulge. We're just going to prune right outside of it. And this seems like it might be a little bit of a stub, but this is the way the tree wants to heal. And every tree is going to have a little bit different layout of that branch bark collar, but it's really important to keep that in mind when pruning. So there's two trees here, right? We look at this shoe-marred oak, and it's pretty obvious. That's where we should make that cut, generally parallel with our branch bark collar. You can even see the little folds there that make it obvious. Hey, this is where you should cut. On this other tree, right, this is a crabapple, much less obvious. So what do we do in these cases, right? We know where to cut here. Where do we cut here? The best idea is to go to 45-degree angle from parallel with the main trunk. And so if you were to draw a line that's 90 degrees on the limb you're going to cut and parallel with our trunk, basically bisect those two lines. And that's where we're going to make our best clean cut to kind of approximate where that branch bark ridge is and facilitate maximum healing that's going to happen. Or more specifically wound closure, not healing, right? And then what happens if we take it off? Well, this is generally what we call a flush cut. And flush cuts are the removal or partial removal of the branch collar. Um, Again, this is opening up you to disease. This is really going to slow that wound response. So the bark collar has all these additional cells that are just sitting there waiting to close over a wound and do that very quickly. If you cut those off, you're basically damaging the tree's ability to close a wound. And so we see this especially on, large trees where someone decided to remove a large limb because it's over a parking lot or whatever. And we'll see, someone who is a novice make these really flush cuts and they never really heal properly in in many cases. Right? We're cutting into that tree protection zone. I just want you guys to be thinking about this as we go further into what are we actually doing on a site. All right. So again, and then the opposite of that is leaving too long of a stub. If we leave too long of a stub, it doesn't give the ability for that tree to close over the wound. And so we end up with, this open point for infection. And so not too far out and not too close. You're kind of looking for the sweet spot of just outside of that branch bark collar. So what leads to the formation of these? It really is dependent on species. For one, like right now we got this oak here. It's very obvious, got this white bark. It's very clear, and this crab apple, right, not so clear. But a big part of why it's not so clear is actually the angle of attachment and the branch aspect ratio, which are two really important pieces of how a branch has grown in relationship to the rest of the tree. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. So the angle of attachment is probably the number one thing when you're thinking about structure pruning a young tree. So for most of you, probably the pruning you're doing is for a young landscape tree or something in your own yard where it's still at the height where it's easy and available to prune. And this is one of the easiest things to correct is angle of attachment, right? If you look at the angle of attachment on this linden, right, we have this very narrow angle of attachment and then a wider angle of attachment. As we talk about that, the wider the angle, the more U-shaped that angle is, generally the stronger the attachment is. It gives it time to form that branch bark collar and the bark ridge, and then and form all that cell knitting. When you have a really narrow V-shaped angle, it forms what's called included bark. And included bark is basically bark that is growing between the two limbs. As those limbs expand and add those rings, it's basically keeping the bark inside and not sealing those two limbs are not growing in tandem with each other. And this provides a great opportunity for breaks and for rot and other things to get into it. So, and it's hard to correct later. Once the tree's limb gets up to, 8 inches, it's really hard to come back and correct that level of included bark. So when the tree's very young, this is a really quick, maybe it takes 10 minutes to make that cut. And for the rest of the life of the tree, you've made a significant difference in its health and vigor. And you can see on this linden where that seam is where there's, if you were to pull on that, just grab those two different limbs and try to rip it apart, you probably could. And you would see that there's actually bark in between in that seam. This also has some other included bark on it, and lindens are kind of notorious for this issue, but that is a particularly bad angle of attachment. And then branch aspect ratio is basically the ratio of the main stem to the trunk. And so when we say trunk, we're looking at that central leader carrying up from the base of the tree up to the top of the tree. That's our ideal, is to have a single central leader on most species. Again, all of this is very species dependent. Some trees do not. Like, think about a crab apple. Rarely are going to have a central leader. And so you really can't, work on that tree so hard to make it have a central leader for the life of the tree, right? The same with really columnar species. We're not going to be able to really work that tree into the perfect single stem tree because it's genetically it's not going to do that. And so, but you're going to still try to do the best you can. This holds true for most trees. So I'm going to go back to the ratio. It's the ratio of the stem to the branches, right? 1 to 1. So if they're the same size, that's generally thought of as a weak attachment, especially with a narrow attachment angle. And then 2/3 of the trunk size is about the maximum you ever want to see a limb. More like 1/3 branch to trunk is the best ratio. So we look at this, right? 1 to 1.5, right? Our main stem is smaller than one of our branches. So we know this is an issue with this tree and something we can correct, or at least work to correct. When should I prune? It's a classic question we get. The real answer is when the saw is sharp, right? It's when you have time to prune. The the research has shown that there's benefits of pruning in the winter and in the summer. So, with except for specific species exceptions, um, prune when you have time to prune, and prune when you can also see the tree. So that's what I prefer winter pruning personally, because I can see the structure of the tree without leaves. But sometimes summer pruning is great because you can see how low that limb gets. In the season when it may, lift up as those leaves drop off in the fall and then get in the way in the summertime. So be aware of that. Some of the biggest disease issues to watch out for would be in Rosaceae. Generally, don't prune those during the growing season. Wait till winter, wait till cold weather. Those would be pears, apples, and hawthorns. Hawthorns to a lesser extent, but pears and apples because of fire blight. So, that an open wound will just allow that disease to get in. Elms, we don't prune any of the American elms, the American native elms, which are Dutch elm disease susceptible. We don't prune those in the summertime because there's a chance they can attract the beetle that then vectors Dutch elm disease. It's not very common these days, but we're still watching out for that. Same for white oak wilt. If you're out in the eastern U.S., again, wintertime pruning just to limit disease vectors. But for the most part, when the saw is sharp is the best time to prune. What tools do you need? If you're going to get out in the field, going to start with please have safety, precautions. If you're going to do anything that's a large limb, have a helmet. Use eye protection, gloves. Orchard ladders are great. Those are those little three-legged ladders there that you see. You can actually stick that one leg through the tree. That's why they're, used heavily in orchard plantations. And then, handsaw. I've got the little Silky logo here. Silky is kind of the gold standard of handsaws. These are incredibly sharp and durable saws, and that's what we use, and most arborists will use for a good handsaw. They're expensive, but if you're going to invest in, or you want to do a lot of structure pruning, or you just want to have it for your yard, it saves you a ton of time to have a very sharp saw. And then a good pair of hand pruners for that small work. Fixing those narrow branch attachments and those branch aspects, you can do it when the tree's very young in 10 seconds with a hand pruner. So it's good to have that as your kit. First thing, whenever you're going to prune any tree, is do a safety site assessment. Even for small trees or for anything you're working on, even if it's a small tree, you're going to be looking up at the canopy. It's best to know what's on the ground first, right? You don't want to have any tripping hazards. If you're going to be pruning around your house, if you have overhead lines at all, be very, very cautious and assume that every line that's out there is dangerous. Every line is a charged line until, proven otherwise. And so treat it that way. Keep an eye out for broken limbs. Don't go pulling on things that you don't know if it's partially attached, whatever. Pulling it down can be very dangerous. Just keep an eye on that, and then keep an eye on who else is around. Who are those pedestrians? What are the other targets in the area before you do any sort of pruning? So you're not, dropping your saw on somebody or whatever. And if you don't feel safe, call an arborist. There's lots of great arborists in the state of Colorado that have great experience in this. So if anything that you go, hey, this doesn't feel, I don't want to be on the ladder or whatever, call an arborist. They're the professionals in this, and it is dangerous work. So the next thing you want to do is, do an assessment of the tree. So you've done your site assessment. Let's do the tree assessment. What are we looking for when we're assessing our tree before pruning? Before we set those objectives, what are we looking for in that tree? Well, the first thing I'll look at is health and vigor. Is the tree growing quickly or is it growing slowly? What is the approximate age of that tree? And how will, in my mind, how is it going to respond um, to pruning based on that? Then obvious signs of disease, right? Do we have any cankers, dead branches, wounds, mushrooms, things like that? Dead branches, crossing branches, those are great things to clear out if you're just going to do minor pruning and you don't want to, really get into the structure pruning end of things. Cutting off dead and crossing branches is always something that's best practice, even on newly planted trees. They say don't prune anything on newly planted trees, but the current logic is, hey, if you're not going to be out there for a while, the best thing to do is cut out dead and crossing branches so it doesn't become an immediate issue. And then look at location concerns, right? Is this a street tree? Is it a front yard tree? Is it up next to my building? What are the location concerns that are going to dictate my how I'm going to prune it? And then structural issues. What are does it have a codominant stem? What is the branch aspect ratio? And then what is the species? Are there species concerns with, timing of pruning, or are there species concerns with how fast this tree is going to grow? So like I've got an elm here in this picture. This is an accolade elm. This incredibly fast growing selection of tree. I may want to hit this tree harder, take off a lot more of it and be more rough than I would be with this tree than I would be with an oak, which is a slower growing species. So keep all those things in mind when you're going out there to do your original assessment of a tree. When I talk about vigor, what I'm really looking at first is kind of the twig extension. So what is the years of growth looking like for a tree? Here are two, this is for Allison. Here's a couple Ohio Buckeyes here. That we can look at for our twig extension, right? And we're looking at our growth nodes over years. So a lot of times on most trees, especially in the winter, you can see the twig extension for the year, which is going to be kind of marketed by this. If you see that little gray extra lines and a kind of a change in the direction of the branch, oftentimes that's where the tree has grown over a year. So on the one on the top, right, I can count 1 year. It's over a foot of growth and then 2 years. So that's, it's a vigorous tree. Where the Buckeye below, we've got, 4 years of growth between nodes. And that's going to show that tree's growing slower. So when I'm talking about pruning in this, hey, if that tree's growing a foot a year and I'm not going to be out there for 5 more years, where is that tree going to be? And how do I need to be thinking about pruning that tree? Or below, right? Hey, it's only grown a foot in the last 4 years. Maybe I don't prune a lot out of this tree because really, if it's in the way, it's not going to be much more in the way in 5 years. It's only growing a foot a year. So I'm going to be lighter and more gentle with that tree. And then our pruning dose comes in here. So when we're thinking about how much we're going to take out of the tree, we never really want to take out more than a quarter of the tree, but it's hard to be precise in the moment and it's very species dependent. So just keep that as a general rule of thumb. But it's not a hard and fast rule. It's very species dependent. A lot of times, especially with something like an almond tree, I'm going to take a lot more of that than 20% or 25%, just because I know that tree is going to, whatever I do, it's going to respond really well versus those oaks and those slower growing species. And then really the end goal is how much do you need to take out of the tree to meet your objective, right? If I need to walk under this tree, but I've got to remove 30-40% of the canopy to get under it, but I need to walk under this tree, that's your objective and that's your number one concern. And so meet that. If it's the right tree in the right place, but also you got to prune it to make sure it fits in the space it's in. So we're ready to prune. Let's talk about how we actually get out there in the field and we're going to do it. So we've got a tree. We've got this bur oak here. Our first thing is we're going to kind of do our site survey of the tree and do our site survey. So we don't have any, hazards or obvious problems here. So we're going to look at the tree and go, what is going to be our objectives here? So we know it's a bur oak, right? It's young and vigorous. This is only probably a 3-inch caliper tree. So we know it's got a lot of good growth in it. We can see that those branch extension grew over a foot this year. So it's a vigorous tree. So we know we can prune it as we'd want to instead of going light on it. We know that it's in a streetscape, so right, we got to get 8 feet over the sidewalk, 14 feet over the road. This is very streetscapes focused right now, but this is just a good example of even if it's a front yard tree, what is your end objective? Where do you want your branches to be? And streets are an easy way to dictate that. Right? It's got no obvious dead or diseased limbs, but it has a codominant stem in the top, right? But it's relatively small, so something we can adjust for now, right? And here's a better photo of where that codominant stem is. Right, we got 2 leaders. They're both fighting for sun. We want to have 1 leader on this tree so we don't have an issue in a snowstorm or something later. Right, so what is our pruning objective? Well, we got to prune it for clearance, right? Because of the space it's in. It needs to be up to 14 feet so that it doesn't get hit by a trash truck. But this tree isn't very large. It's not an immediate issue. It's not going to be our immediate concern. Our immediate concern is we're out here now. We can correct this codominant stem. So how are we going to correct this codominant stem? So here's our codominant, right? There's 2 ways we can correct that. One would be make a reduction cut. So there's 2 types of cuts we'll talk about today. Reduction cuts, which are going to be reducing the length of a limb to reduce its vigor, right? Trees are using chemical signals to grow, essentially. If you remove some of that tree or remove that foliage, it's going to also, slow down the growth of that limb and prioritize another limb. So you could do a reduction cut by removing, say, half of this limb and letting the other the lead outgrow this branch and then eventually removing this codominant stem. Or you can do a removal cut, which would just be in one cut, let's just take this whole limb off to, I'm not going to be out here for 5 more years. This is what I'm going to talk about this a lot. If you can be out there every year, maybe I'd prioritize a reduction cut, right? I can reduce it this year. I can see how it responds. And If it didn't respond, well, or the other limb responded very well, it's outgrowing the other limb, and now this limb's getting shaded out, then I can remove it in a couple years. But if I'm not going to be out there for 5 years, maybe I don't want to take that chance. Maybe I want to know that I've fixed this problem and I can walk away. While this is more, more canopy removed from the tree, it's usually an okay thing to do, especially on smaller size diameter trees. So we're going to do a removal cut. And Melissa here is our pruner, and she's going to be doing a lot of the pruning here in this slideshow. So, right, we're going to action shot here. We're going to take that limb off. First thing we're going to do is we're going to make a rough cut. This is not a final cut. We're just trying to remove the weight out of this limb. And it's not a very large limb, so you can put one hand on it and remove it as it's cut. And then we're going to make a finish cut to, cut that limb to where we think it can heal over. And then we have this now a single leader tree. And you can see how it's a little bald on one side, but those limbs with the additional sun and additional energy will fill in, and you won't even be able to notice in a couple of years that this has happened, other than that this tree will now have a nice central leader as opposed to a double leader. And there's our finished cut, right? We're going to cut it at roughly that 45-degree angle or something that makes sense where we're kind of approximating that branch bark collar. All right, so that's going to be kind of how we're looking at, that finish cut. Now we're looking at how are we limbing this tree up or lifting the canopy so that it meets those goals? Should we just remove everything? We're out here, right? We may not be out here for 5 years. Is it best to just take all that canopy up? Well, yes and no. If you really know that it's going to be in the way, like it's going to be at 8 feet, it's already at 8 feet, we're going to cut this limb off. Sure, but what those lower limbs are really doing for the tree is helping build trunk taper. So having more limbs on a tree is beneficial for building trunk taper. Don't remove all the limbs, right? We do see this on people. This was actually a failed removal where they decided they weren't going to remove it halfway through and actually tacked on a 2x4 to stop the tree from tipping over after making their cut. But we don't want to leave popsicles, right? We want to leave those low limbs to help that tree build taper. And so what I'm marking here is looking at permanent limbs and kind of how those limbs whirl around the tree. A lot of trees, when they're young, will put out a lot of limbs very close together. And if it was in a forest setting, those limbs would be shaded off. But in open grown trees, they're often not shaded out. And so we have too dense of limb structure, which can be poor for, we talk about the attachment angle and, that, you know, branch aspect ratio. This can be challenging for that. And so we'll look at where are our permanent limbs on this tree and how do they correlate to each other. So we're trying to plan for this kind of world look to the tree of this 1 to 2 foot spacing between limbs. And so our first branch to permanent branch spacing is important to think about as that tree holistically, but don't do it all at once. This is incremental. Think about these things as a future and plan for them, but trees grow slowly. Be kind to them when you're out there pruning. All right, we got a second tree here. This is a little different situation. This when we look at with the poor branch aspect ratio. So we know it's a honey locust. It's young and vigorous. It's grown over a foot this last year. We need street and sidewalk clearance, right? So we want this tree to come up. It's already in the way of the street, and it's in the way a little bit on the sidewalk. So that's something we can immediately address. There's no obvious disease or dead branches. We have this poor branch aspect ratio. So if we look at this, the central leader is not a real obvious central leader. And this is a common trait in honey locusts. And it isn't necessarily an end-all be-all because that, the angle of attachment is pretty good. Those are going to be strong branches. But we really, as far as for future growth on this tree, we would like to be able to limit up higher and have that trunk start, the first branch start higher than these branches are right now. So we look at these as temporary branches, even though they're fairly large. So how are we going to address that with that central leader? Well, we're going to look at reduction cuts. So back to our first point, we looked at that oak. What are our two options? We have reduction and we have removal. These would be reduction cuts, right? We've got the central part of this stem going straight up, and then we've got these side branches, and we're going to take the central part of those side branches and remove them so they no longer compete. And it looks like that one's a central branch, and we'll remove part of it, but it's really coming towards us. So we're going to take these branches back, again, to reduce the energy in the branch. If we think about that branch aspect ratio as pipes, right? The roots are providing all the water for the pipes, right? It's providing all the energy, it's providing all the nutrients. So you have a certain amount of volume that comes up. If each pipe is taking amount of the volume, you want the trunk to be the largest piece of that volume. If a side branch is taking that energy, that side branch is just going to get bigger. And so we want to slow that down. And part of slowing it down is doing these reduction cuts to remove that energy from the tree, remove its priority towards that branch, and push the energy into that central leader. So the next time we prune it, we can remove that branch or reduce it further. So we'll set up on site, right? We're going to make our first cut here. Let's figure out where we're going to cut. Think about that branch bark collar, branch bark ridge, and the branch collar. Let's make a cut that makes sense. We're going to remove it, and we're going to make a finished cut. So there's our first cut. You can see this canopy is already a lot thinner. This is a bigger limb, and so when we're removing a larger limb, it's important to do it in steps so you're not dropping all that weight at once and peeling back the bark. I'm sure anybody who's pruned a tree has had the moment where you just go, oh no, this is, I've done something horribly wrong. And you start making a cut and it just starts peeling back the bark. So when we're making these larger cuts, we're going to walk through how we do this properly so we're not having that issue. So first things first, start higher than your cut's going to be and just remove weight out of the tree, right? Reducing weight can help limit tearing, it can help limit property damage, all these different things. Take things in pieces. And then we're going to do a three-part cut. If anybody's familiar with three-part cut, this is the best method for removing large limbs. Um, and the first step of it is to make an undercut. So cut opposite of where you'd think. Usually you cut from the top of the limb to go with the weight of the branch, but this would be an undercut. And the undercut's purpose is to provide a place that it doesn't tear through the rest of the bark. So we're going to make an undercut, right? There's our undercut. Maybe cut a third of the way through the branch, not enough that the branch becomes unstable, but enough that you have no way to tear that bark because that bark is no longer attached. We're going to make a cut above on the limb, above that back cut down, right? And this is what we call a snap cut. Because a snap cut, you're not going all the way through. On some limbs, you could go all the way through, but this is when we go most of the way through. But because of the gap there, we can actually break off that piece. And so we're in control 100% of the time with that cut. So we're not having any tearing. Some species will really, really tear, and depends also on the season. In the spring, we'll say the bark will start to slip, and that's especially with elms and crab apples and other things. As you cut, it'll just peel the bark out. So this is a great way to limit that kind of damage, right? And then we're going to make our third cut is that finish cut of the three-part cut. So our cuts are the back cut, the through cut, and then a finish cut. And here's our finished cut, right? We have this nice clean edge where we can see that cambium layer. We know it's going to heal properly. And having a sharp saw is a great way to make sure all this happens the way you want it to. All right, so now the last thing we're going to do is just get a little clearance on this tree. And you can see, as I hop between these two photos, we've removed a lot of the canopy, maybe more than 25%, but our objective was to correct these issues with the branch aspect ratio and get clearance. And I think by the pruning we did, both these things were achieved. Something to keep an eye on always is your brush pile. How much have I removed out of this tree? Have I done more than my dose and have I met my objectives? It's really hard to say 25% when you're working. When you get to the ground, you can look at the brush pile and go, okay, that probably met my objective, right? And reduction cuts can be a slow process. They slow the growth of that limb, but they're not often a one and done. And so you may need to be done multiple times. So on this oak, these are pretty terrible codominant stems. Somebody has come in and done a reduction cut, but the tree has really, responded to that cut by providing more growth. And so we've got this, still a very large limb that we may have to do another round of reduction cuts. And you can see on this maple here, this has happened multiple times. This is a tree that naturally has a very upright, narrow growth form, but to try to keep a sort of central leader, the arborists who've worked on this tree for the city of Fort Collins have come through and done reduction cuts over many years to try and keep this tree and give it good form so it doesn't break up in a snowstorm or wind event or whatever. And all this would fit in the bucket of structure pruning, right? Always remove crossing branches. So if you find a crossing branch, those are going to be an immediate issue. Don't hesitate to remove them, even if they're a large part of the canopy. There's no need to reduce. The problem's always just going to get worse, and so just cut those out. And it's better for the tree health. If there's going to be a damaged limb, so say there is a big snow event or wind event or something, We got a limb that's broken off. It's peeled off the bark. It's done, made this massive wound. What should I do, right? Should I chase it? Should I, cut off more? Really try to imagine that that branch bark collar is still there and cut where you would normally. Like you can see this limb was one that on a bur oak that broke out in a snowstorm a bunch of years ago. And it is healing over. It's just healing over slowly because of the size of that wound. But you can see where that large limb was, where they cut it. You can see that's healing better because of the approximation of the branch bark ridge and branch collar. So just make that assumption if you're cutting out anything after a snowstorm. And don't chase it. If it's got this tear all the way down the tree, just cut it in a place that's logical above the bottom of the tear. Don't do more damage by trying to get in there and fix the problem because it's not, you can't fix the problem at that point in time. All you can do is mitigate the damage done. All right. One of the biggest issues we see in pruning, and it is easy to do if you're just gung-ho and pruning without an objective, right, is lion's tailing and crown clearing. This is like Arborist 101, do not do this. You can see these three ash trees have been lion's tailed. We call it lion's tail because it looks like the tuft at the end of a tail. Basically, that is removing the internal branching of the tree. The tree has internal branching for a reason. There's no reason to remove it. It's not a structural issue. Um, Pruning should be done starting at the outer tips of the tree to address structural issues, but the internal canopy should only be removed if there's, say, if you're having an arborist over your house and he starts removing limbs, say, hey, unless you need to access that area to make a structural cut, leave all the internal limbs on the tree. This also makes them more vulnerable to wind damage because you may think about a lever arm, right? You've put all your weight at the top of the lever, and in the wind, you have nothing internal to help buffer that effect. So really, really focus on starting at the outside of the tree and working in, or if you're recommending, or talking with an arborist, somebody's coming to your house and pruning, really emphasize, I want you to start at the tips of the branches and work into the tree. And 90% of the pruning should be done in the top 10% of the canopy, that outer 10% of the rim, with the exception, as we looked at in young trees where you have to make these big structural cuts, right? Got some funky stuff here. This is a tree that somebody tried to fix an issue. Really, there is no fixing issues. This was using, like cellophane and tape. You can't fix a tree once it's broken. It doesn't heal, right? They only close over wounds. It's not going to knit back together except for in very specific cases with grafting. This is one that I found was an absolute hoot. This was somebody called me up and said, "Hey, there's a contractor out here, and they've nailed the bark back to the tree." And I thought, "No way, this will never work." Here it is, a couple years later, and it's reattached. It didn't heal, but it wasn't detached on both ends, so it did close over the wound. And then, well, I'll just say this is the kind of ubiquitous. Don't top trees. If you see someone topping a tree, give them the what for. This is the worst practice in a burrow culture that's ever been done, and it's super common in people that don't know what they're doing, right? This is just removing limbs arbitrarily. There's no objective. There's no goal. We're just removing limbs to remove limbs. This is really popular East and West Coast where trees grow quickly. People say, I don't want it that tall. I'm just going to take the top out of it. Basically, the long-term effect is that this opens up all those ends to disease. These are not wounds that heal over easily. You have a lot of epicormic or water sprouting. Those are all those little sprouts you can see coming off the tree. And those are generally very weak attachments. And so in a weather or storm event, or as that limb gains more weight, it'll just break. And so this just makes this tree not only ugly and have a shorter lifespan, it also just essentially is going to make it a hazard to the surrounding property. So this is just absolutely do not do it. This is very different than pollarding. This is my sister out in Los Angeles. Probably the same day I took the other photo. This is pollarding. Pollarding is where you've worked the top of that tree back for many years. As you can see, it forms these nodes of basically where it has a bunch of dormant buds that break every time you remove them. And this is a yearly process of removing back to the base of those branches to have a desired effect. This is not topping. This is a separate thing. This is not common in Colorado because it's a high effort, very high, kind of old school, old world thing to do in Europe. Pruning fruit trees, we'll just briefly touch on pruning fruit trees. This is a very different methodology of pruning. This is one of the only places we'll make heading cuts, which are almost like the topping, but it's basically to work that tree down, but it's a yearly process. So it's kind of between topping and pollarding is this fruit tree pruning. And the objectives are different, right? When we're pruning a fruit tree, they're usually very fast growing, especially when young. We're trying to maximize fruit production, reduce the time span for that tree to produce fruit. We're trying to make it easy to pick, and we're trying to make it fit the space, whether that's in a line or in a backyard or whatever. And so fruit trees can be any size you want them to be. You just need to be really on top of pruning them. This is the same tree after I was done with it, right? We're trying to get sun penetration to the middle of the tree so the fruit can get sun and airflow, which will help it limit disease. We're trying to have a low first branch so that our first fruit set is going to be low. We're going to spread branches. We're actually going to manually put wires or pieces of wood to spread those branches out to give that, an open canopy form. And then we're going to prune this tree yearly for best results. August pruning can be done if done correctly to limit disease spread, to help early fruit set. And this is very species specific. Like on an apple tree, I'll hit it very hard in the winter, prioritizing leaving spur buds over, tip growth to get it to flower. But with prunus, if you prune it this hard, you're just cutting off all the flowers for spring, and you won't have any crop. Very brief on fruit trees. If anybody has any more questions, I'm happy to answer. And that's where we're at. We're at questions here. Has anybody got any questions for me?
I have a question, Freddie. So as a as a city forester, you're kind of in a position where you are obviously caring for the city's trees, but you're working with private companies to do a lot of homeowner things. Can you explain that relationship and how someone might use a city forester to either get good recommendations of arborists or navigating challenges that you might face?
Totally. So the two pieces of that is one, we license in the City of Fort Collins and other municipalities, we license every arborist that comes in. We make sure they have, insurance and all these other pieces that make it so they're doing the work safely at the very least. And we have an annual meeting where we'll go through best practices and hey, don't top trees, all this sort of stuff. We'll take, and we also can, because they're all licensed, if we see them doing, really adverse practices, we can take them into our office and say, hey, here's what I'm seeing. Let's walk through this, or we'll have to take your license away. So that really helps regulate from a top down on that quality of care. As the homeowner, say you're looking for an arborist, our website and many other cities' website have a list of licensed contractors. You can always call us and say, hey, I have this specific task. Can you give me a few companies? I can't give you specific recommendations, but I can give you, as long as I give you a list, it's okay. If you see specific concerns, like you see a contractor, you hired a contractor, and you don't think they did good work, always send us a picture. We're always happy to take a pic. We can't always do a site visit. We're always happy to take a picture, and say, hey, yeah, that's lion's tailing. I'm happy to always do that. Instead of you have to do the follow-up, I'm always happy to do the follow-up conversation. Say, hey, man, I was driving by and I saw this. This doesn't cut mustard. Let's talk about your process here. Um, and then if it's anything in the streetscape, we do the work. And so that's something we like to tell people is, hey, they're paying tax dollars and it goes into us doing all the maintenance. So if you've got any concerns about the street trees, which is anything between the curb and the sidewalk, we're happy to do that maintenance and get it on our schedule.
That is so helpful. Thank you. Okay, so you open it for questions, and here they come. So the first one is more about bark damage from either squirrels, grasshoppers, things like that. Can you expand on bark damage with chewing insects,
Yeah,
animals?
it's very challenging, right? It's the same kind of healing process, but the tree is basically what they've gone for. But squirrels and grasshoppers, whatever, they're not going for the bark. They're usually going for that cambium layer, right? That growth, that cell growth there is also high in sugars, and so in the right time of year and the right species, squirrels will just go nuts for it. There really isn't, other than trying to keep them out of it, which is I understand is very challenging. Just letting the tree heal, do its best to heal works. If it's totally girdled, if it's gone all the way around and that limb is now, losing leaves or whatever, it's just a goner. And then the best thing to do is to make the most logical pruning cut back to a logical point where the tree can heal. But it's really, really challenging. It's something we deal with constantly in hackberry with squirrels. And there really is not a good solution. The trees can heal, but with repeat damage, especially, that callus tissue is basically really thick cambium layer and it has a lot of sugars in it. So oftentimes they'll just go right for where it's healing and then open that wound up multiple times. And that is really challenging. So I don't have a great recommendation other than that. Yeah, that is rough.
Squirrels, the bane of my existence. What are your thoughts on tree cabling?
Cabling has its place, right? And so there's just kind of this other level of, you know, say that tree is a really mature tree, you love it, it's in your front yard, you wouldn't lose it no matter the cost, right? Your grandmother planted it, it's 150 years old, whatever. Um, Cabling has its place. Now, it has to be done right to be effective, and it has to be maintained very regularly. So you have to have an arborist looking at that to make sure it's still holding and it's safe and all these other things. So cabling is a best practice for maintaining very old trees with an obvious defect. And so what they'll do in the cable is they'll go 2/3 of the way up from the union where you have the issue, right? If you got codominant stems, they're going to be narrow stems. You're going to go 2/3 of the way up to the top of the tree from that codominant stem and install a cable and then reduce, again, starting at the top 10% of the tree, you're going to reduce those limbs back to then limit the weight being placed on those cables. Again, there's lots of companies that do that and do a really good job with it, but you have to be on top of it. Otherwise, the cable will fail, and then it's just creating an extra wound to the tree. Basically, you have to drill through the tree to install a cable. So that would be my caution on it.
So is it, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it essentially true that if you do cable, you're admitting a structural defect in the tree, and so
Hmm.
that tree could be more susceptible to failure long
Yep.
term?
Cabling is the way to stop it or a way to mitigate the likelihood of it failing, right? So you're basically saying, I know there's an issue. Maybe it's not, it's not actively failed, but maybe you've got this codominant stem and you go, man, in the wrong windstorm, this thing is going to fall apart. And we know this tree is partially hollow, blah, blah. You have all these other risk factors. And that's where getting an arborist who does that kind of work to do a full risk assessment of the tree. So there's a risk assessment qualification that's been done. Do a risk assessment of the tree and then make a recommendation. And if cabling is one of those recommendations, but I would never push for cabling. I always would start with let's do tip reduction. A lot of trees that need cabling also need kind of retrenchment pruning or things because they're in that overly mature phase of a tree's life where they're really not growing a lot. They're just kind of in this slow decline or stasis. And so start with pruning, and cabling is kind of a last option for retaining those very high dollar trees.
Excellent. Can you comment about trees that might bleed, aspens, cottonwoods, maples, and then the best time of year to address that?
So the trees that we have that bleed, maples are kind of the number one thing that bleeds. People will notice it. Wintertime pruning, they'll, just like maple syrup, late winter, those things are going to open up and just put out sap. Yellowwood is the same way. With one we've noticed we got some calls about smooth gray bark, sap's obvious. Summertime pruning, they won't bleed. But what the research has shown is that the bleeding doesn't really matter. It's an aesthetic thing. And so best practice is, again, when the saw is sharp, if you don't have any other time to be out to prune that tree, prune it in the wintertime. The bleeding is going to it's going to look severe and like you've done this horrible thing, but it doesn't affect the tree's health. Um, but if you have time to prune it in the summer and you don't want it to bleed, go right ahead.
What about suckers at the base of the tree or water sprouts at the top?
Water sprouts are usually a sign of some sort of stress, right? Like it's had a serious cut made, you've removed a big limb, and it's a response growth. The tree's producing all these hormones, and they're not going anywhere. So they're going to go into these dormant buds and produce these water sprouts. And so that's usually a symptom of something. And so look at it. And some trees just water sprout more than others. Um, and you don't necessarily remove them. The tree needs that growth, but maybe limit the length of them if they're accessible, cut them back, help them build that energy back so they can put growth into where they need to and selectively remove water sprouts. As far as suckers at the base, it's very species to species dependent. A lot of them have to do with grafting or what the rootstock is, or if it's a suckering plant. It's not something that you can just deal with other than cutting them off. It's going to be a yearly battle. If you want, some trees will respond better especially if it's naturally a multi-stem tree like gamble oak or like a suckering chokecherry. Let some of those suckers go, and that will help draw energy away from the other suckers but it'll be a multi-stem plant. It won't ever be perfect, and a lot of gamble oak will always have that low level of sucker growth at the bottom. And so it's just something you got to deal with, and it can be difficult in the wrong landscape. And there's not really a good option or chemical option for dealing with it that doesn't harm the tree.
So, in regards to pruning fruit trees, in order to encourage production, you would still, can you talk about the pruning cycle as the tree matures?
Yeah. So when you've got a young tree, it depends on the type of fruit tree, right? So um, in prunus, we'll start with prunus because they oftentimes get kind of neglected and can have poor structure. Prunus, you can summertime prune. There is diseases that can get into them, but in most cases, if you're not in a big orchard setting where you have this mass amount of disease and things floating around, you can summertime prune them. And what I recommend is pruning them multiple times throughout the season, like almost hedging them, because you can get multiple branches in one year instead of having these long singular branches that have to be cut back, and that can improve the time frame in which you're getting fruit. So if you just have one branch that's very, very long, it'll have flowers on it, you have a few fruit, and they're far away from the trunk. And especially if it's like some of the hybrid plums, they'll produce so much fruit they'll break the branches. And so really what you want to do is keep the branches close to the tree and prune it regularly, yearly or more than yearly in prunus to make it keep the fruit and flowers close to the trunk and that it's small. In apples and pears, they form what's called spur buds, which are there's two types of buds. There's a shoot, this kind of shoot extension growth, and then there's a spur bud growth. Spur buds are going to be small buds where you're going to see the flowers and fruit. That's what you want to prioritize. There's a couple ways to prioritize that. One, after you got that structure set on the tree for young trees, that pruning once a year is pretty good for that. The structure set that you want and kind of the size you want is to yearly prune back. So you're only allowing, 5, 6 inches of growth a year on that tree. It may want to grow 2 feet. And you're going to cut it back to 5 or 6 inches. That regular stress is going to force that tree to fruit earlier and also fruit close to those main stems and where it's going to bear that weight the best. There is, some of the orchard practices is to August prune, um, especially when the weather is very hot. There's high of risk of fire blight is to August prune, and August pruning will cause that tree to do a second flush, which will produce more spur buds and actually produce fruit faster on younger trees. And so those would be the ways to kind of prioritize between prunus and malus and pyrus. It's just really regular pruning is the best way to go about it. And, a lot of people will put things on dwarfing rootstock. I'm not a fan of dwarfing rootstock in that it just shortens the lifespan of trees when really that same dwarfing effect can be done through regular pruning. It just takes more maintenance. And it takes you having the conscious thoughts of, hey, let's August prune. This is a little more risky, but I'm going to do these things to then force this tree to fruit younger, which is the same thing. The dwarfing rootstock is just stressing the tree into fruiting at a younger age. And so you're going to manually be doing that. And it will give you a longer lived tree. Hope that answered the question.
That was great. So I just want to mention a couple things. And again, this was recorded. You can watch this later. The second thing is if you're in a dry part of the state or elsewhere, please winter water your trees. It is still very nice out. The soils
Oh,
mostly
yeah.
haven't frozen. So get out and winter water. And also the third thing is if you have a city forester or trusted people that you maybe could shadow, reach out to them, see if you could follow along and watch them prune, because they are more than likely willing to share their knowledge with you. So, Freddie, one last question before we get off.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on fertilization and deep root feeding?
In Colorado, our soils already have plenty of nutrients for the trees that are going to work. It would be my impression. We already have enough phosphorus and nitrogen in most places, and that's really what's going to be applied with deep root feeding and fertilization. Especially if you got turf grass anywhere near it, it's got more nitrogen than it ever knows what to do with. Especially and in conifers, this can be a problem because they don't respond the same way as broadleaf plants do to nitrogen and phosphorus, and so it can actually be detrimental to their health. The best thing you can do is just water. Water, water, water is the end all be all for trees. There is trees that have nutrient deficiencies, but likely it's just because it's not a good tree for Colorado. And our recommendation for City for Colin, especially like autumn blaze maple, is hey, you can fight it, you can get an arborist to inject it, but it's a losing battle. It's best to remove and replace while the tree is alive, so it's not more expensive to remove and replace. So basically, my thing is like Al said, winter water is your number one thing, regular summer water is your number two thing, and then prioritize your money on getting that tree structure pruned. Don't waste money on deep root feeding and fertilization.
Excellent. Well, I know there's still questions coming in, but in the interest of time, we are going to cut it off. I'm sorry, everybody. If you do have questions, reach out to either your local city forester or your local extension faculty member, and they will absolutely help you out. Freddie, thank you so much for this. It was absolutely amazing, and we appreciate it. And Cassie, thank you for the back end. We answered 31 questions today, so that was quite a few. Lots of interest in this subject. And thanks again to everybody for supporting CSU Extension, and we hope to see you on December 10th. Take care.